Hey there, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. Okay, so this week's episode is sort of the sequel and sort of like a mirror image of last week's episode. So, last week's episode, I talked about confidence and self confidence. And this week's episode is going to actually look at sort of the same situation, but from the opposite perspective. And it's been inspired by several conversations I've had recently with clients as well as with myself, to be honest, um, about our fear of the future. You know, our old friend, anticipatory anxiety, if you've heard that term before. So, if you're anything like me, you have some amount of anticipatory anxiety. Some of us have it more like dread, but a lot of us have this idea of like fear or resistance or sadness about the future. And especially around work, a lot of us have it, so we have people call it the Sunday scaries before they start work on Monday. People have it dread of going back to work after vacation. People have it at the beginning of each day, they have it at the beginning of each visit, and like depending on the visits, it can vary, right? So something that I think is like really important to know that can be hard to fully conceptualize, but is actually the only thing that's going on. When we feel anticipatory anxiety about something that we know is about to happen or that we're afraid might happen, the only thing we're really afraid of is what we will make it mean, and therefore how we will feel about that situation. And even to get more clear, if we lived in a world where none of us ever felt shame, where we never beat ourselves up, where we never made ourselves wrong and bad and looked down on ourselves because of our actions or because of the world at large, we would all have less to no anticipatory anxiety. So it's interesting. A lot of us spend time trying to manage our anticipatory anxiety by staying in the moment, by, meditating and calm breathing and soothing our future self. And all that stuff's like really good. But another approach is actually just to, and it's not like a little just, it's a radical act to do this, but to practice each day whenever you catch yourself to stop beating yourself up for things, to stop judging yourself, and to stop um, reinforcing the shame cycle, right? So a clear example is say your patient comes into the room and they're angry with you. And say, let's like give an example to start with where you've made an error. You forgot to send in a requisition that they really wanted you to. Now you're back the next time and they're furious at you, right? So if you knew you made that error and you already maybe knew that the patient was mad at you, like maybe the secretary's like, watch out, this patient's pretty mad at you. How much anticipatory anxiety do you have going into that room? Do you just feel totally charged up? Are you actually on the defense? Are you already kind of mad at them? Like, but it's like all because you are anxious about the way it will feel in that room with that patient as they're yelling at you. And the leap most of us make is it's because they make us feel bad. But there's actually a layer in between because a patient's anger and their judgment cannot, in and of itself, make us feel bad. The only way it can land in our bodies as bad, mad, shame, a shame story where they're mad and therefore we're bad, is if we already believe that we're bad. If we are reinforcing a pre existing belief that, by the way, none of us gave to ourselves, that we are bad. The way we know this is if you walk into a situation where you don't think you're bad, where you feel like you've done your best, you're a human and you make some mistakes, and the person's really mad at you. You don't have anxiety walking into that situation. Instead, you walk into the situation, you hold space saying, I hear you. Wow, I would be mad too. I totally hear you. I'm sorry, if you know you've made a mistake, but you don't make the entire situation mean something bad about yourself and feel a ton of shame about it, right? Now, I think it's really important to reinforce something I've said in many podcasts before, but like it's just pretty critical to say here. No one judges themselves for fun. No one makes themselves feel bad on purpose. The reason we do it is because it was taught to us. It was socialized and socially conditioned into us. These aren't like flaws to our personality that this silly me, why can't I stop judging myself? These are wounds from our past in situations where other people saw us doing human things like forgetting things, making mistakes, having human emotions, being alive, frankly, and they made us bad, like when we were younger, where we didn't know that we were allowed to have our own opinion of ourselves, right? So it's a it's a gradual but beautiful process to recognize that that's all that's happening. So when we anticipate anything in the future, when we really struggle with making a decision because we're afraid that if we choose wrong, we will give ourselves a bad future where we make ourselves wrong. If, like I talked about in the last episode, we practice that self-confidence, that self-compassion, where we practice pausing the self-judgment and just even looking at the situation neutrally. If loving yourself seems too far, something that I have been experimenting with recently myself and with clients is like, what if it was just physically impossible for you to feel shame? Like, what if they extracted the part of your brain that feels shame about something? So all you could feel is totally neutral about this person's reaction to you, about the outcome of a situation. Like, it wasn't even on the menu for you to make yourself wrong or bad or blame yourself in any way. And just like think about what the situation would look like from that standpoint and actually practice looking at a situation this way. Like, what would you see differently? Almost visualize it. So imagine a situation where a patient's mad at you. And this helps to practice ahead of time or after the fact, right? So in the heat of the moment is the time where all the hot, sticky emotions come out. Probably you're going to feel a bit of shame because we're deeply socialized to do so, but after the fact, maybe, right? So that, oh my gosh, I'm cringing so hard. That thing just happened. I want to beat myself up more for how terrible it was and how I made all the wrong choices and how I'm a terrible person. If we just pause and said, okay, what if we just quickly perform that brain surgery and take out the part of our brain that's capable of feeling shame? And we look at the situation again. What actually happened? What even is there for us to see about everything that led up to that encounter, everything that led up to making that mistake, or even if there's no mistake and the person's just really pissed at you, it's like everything that may have led up to that person feeling that way. You'll see the situation so much clearer, including often having more compassion, not only for yourself, but the other person. But sometimes it helps to kind of view it as a neutral thing instead of trying to force compassion. When we view it from this neutral, like, what happens if we remove the shame from the situation? We just pretend it's not there. We take it off, take that layer off the cake and see what's underneath. What emerges? A recent example I've been talking about with a couple of patients, a couple of clients, and also really am learning to embody myself is like the shame of being late. I recall one client a while ago being like, I'm actually just a late person and had a whole story about that and that made them wrong in their family and like all these things, right? Like we have this deep time shame as if we have control over time, which we super do not, right? But like using an example of arriving at a later time than the agreed upon time for an appointment. Like even like taking out the word late, which can be triggery, but it's like, okay, my appointment was scheduled to be 9 a.m. and I walked into the room at 9:45 a.m. Whatever it is, right? If we weren't allowed to beat ourselves up or judge ourselves or shame ourselves for it, how would we view that situation? Including how would we show up to that situation, right? So if we feel a bunch of shame about the fact that we're late and we have a whole time shame lateness story, often we'd show up to the encounter and we'd be so apologetic or we'd be super defensive and rushy. We would not listen to the patient as well. We would cut them off probably a bunch of times. We try and force our way through the encounter. We may miss things in the encounter. Sometimes we actually feel guilty. And so we spend extra time to make up for the fact that they've waited. All of these things make things less efficient. All of these things are going to take more of your time, not less. And therefore, they're going to perpetuate the same time shame spiral, right? Versus if you walk into that room and are like, this is the time the appointment's starting. It's neither good nor bad. Perhaps you still thank the person for waiting or whatever that comes to you that just makes sense on a human to human level. But if you're not feeling like you have to make up for the badness of being late, but you're just like, here we go. This is the appointment time. How much more capacity does your brain have to just listen in that room? How much more attuned are you to what's happening in the room? And how much more likely are you to actually still stay as efficient, if not become more efficient, because you're just tuned into what the patient actually wants, what is within your capacity, and the visit proceeds from there. When I stopped trying to make up for lost time with patients, it was incredible how much quicker I got in appointments. Like, it's incredible. And that was because I stopped shaming myself about the time that I arrived at any given appointment. I have less anxiety about being late now that I no longer make it mean that I'm a bad person if I'm late. You see? So, often a great place to start if you have a ton of anticipatory anxiety about whatever it is about your day. Look at the shame. Look at the pattern that your brain has learned over time to survive, but now is no longer necessary. Of what happens if, when I catch myself beating myself up, I say, oh, okay, let's take off the shame layer and let's see what's underneath. Let's do the shame lobotomy and see what's underneath and just see what happens when we view the situation in a shameless manner. What arises and what's left, for what capacity does that give back to us so we're not being drained by shame instead. This is a practice. I definitely still feel like a tingle of time shame for sure. And I notice, especially on days where I'm under resourced, or maybe I've watched too much social media or whatever, like I haven't really connected with myself and my body, and what I know helps me remember my aliveness and my worthiness as a human. Then I have more of all the old patterns come back. So like, this is a flow, it's a practice, but I encourage you to consider it. What is it that you have a lot of anticipatory anxiety about? And what is it that you're, on the surface level, your brain thinks that you're afraid of? So are you afraid that people will be mad at you? Are you afraid people will judge you? Are you afraid you'll get kicked out of the club? Are you afraid that so you're going to get sued? Are you afraid a patient's going to die? What are you afraid of? And really, when you zoom in on that, underneath the surface event you think will happen to you if this event comes to pass, notice that underneath, the most painful part of that event that you are anticipating ahead of time is the shame you will feel, the way you will beat yourself up, the way that your body will register you as a bad person because of that event. So then if you extricate the option for it to mean that you're a bad person, if you know you're going to stay with yourself and be with yourself and practice viewing the situation as like a neutral situation, no matter what, then notice what starts to happen with your anticipatory anxiety. It usually starts to settle down on its own, because now the future is not under threat, because you know you'll have your back and be with yourself no matter what. I hope that's helpful. It's been coming up in so many conversations, and it just came up in a couple client conversations actually. And so I felt like I have to make sure I expand on what I talked about last week and view it almost from the other angle, because this is a concept that I wish everyone knew so deeply. Let me know if it resonates with you. Reach out to me at Joan Chan MD on Instagram, or go to my website, joanchanmd.com. I would love to know what about this episode resonated with you, and share it with a friend if it inspires you. Okay, take care. I'll see you next time.